Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to part 5 of our 7.1 lecture, which is about the unification and gradual decline of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is our shortest section of the lecture, so you are very close to being done. This brings us to the state of Austria in the 1850s and 1860s. What is happening in Austria and their empire during this period of the Realpolitik? We will not going to see any charismatic, talented leaders emerge like we do in France or Italy or Germany. In fact, this is really the beginning of the end for the Austrian Empire as it begins its slow decline until its eventual death in World War I. So I've titled this slide The Habsburgs and the Hungarians because really the politics of the Austrian Empire in the 1850s and 1860s is how the Habsburg monarchy is able to deal with the Hungarian minority and other ethnic minorities in the Austrian Empire. So let's start with the revolutions of 1848, which is basically where we've started with every other section. The revolutions of 1848 were also largely a failure in Austria in the sense that it did not produce a liberal government. It did not create much lasting change. However, it did get rid of Metternich. That's a bonus, right? Because Metternich had basically been the figurehead of the conservative repression and the concert of Europe. So that in and of itself had introduced a significant change. But at the end of 1848, the Habsburg monarchy had been successful in restoring their centralized authoritarian government and crushing all of the rebellions across their empire. The only real lasting result of the revolutions of 1848 was beyond the dismissal of Metternich, was actually the emancipation of the serfs. So Austria finally emancipated the serfs and ended all compulsory labor services on September 7th of 1848. Now, of course, this is significant because it allows Austria to begin its industrialization and its modernization after 1850. However, this modernization of Austria would actually bring about economic and social change to the empire with an urban proletariat, which produces even more unrest. Now we have social class unrest on top of the ethnic minority unrest and a new middle class. So it's going to actually introduce new levels of tension and conflict into the empire. Now in the 1850s, the Habsburgs still controlled the imperial government in the Austrian Empire. We're on our second bullet point now. This was still a very authoritarian government where local privileges were subordinated to a unified system of administration, law, and taxation. And the central government was entirely dominated by Germans, even though Germans were only one of 11 different ethnic groups in the empire. The Hungarians, which had led the 1848 revolutions and had long been the most antagonistic of the ethnic groups, had been put under military rule. The Catholic Church had been declared the state church, was given complete control over education. The Catholic Church and the Habsburgs, as we know, have a very long-standing, very close relationship. So the Austrian emperor at this point, Francis Joseph I, actually did attempt to establish a parliament after Austria's loss in the Italian Wars. So the Italian Wars took place in the early 1860s. But this only produced a German-speaking majority in the parliament, which served to alienate other ethnic minorities, especially the Hungarians. And this ultimately produced even more arguments and challenges from liberals, from bureaucrats, and other ethnic groups. So Austria had clamped down on its authoritarianism and its conservatism, but it is not maintaining its authority very well. The Habsburgs are not. In the 1860s, there were some attempts at modernization customs barriers, meaning trade barriers within the empire, were abolished. The capital of Vienna was modernized as they were strongly influenced by Napoleon III's reconstruction of Paris. So Vienna, too, is reconstructed into the beautiful city it is today. And there's also some industrialization with railroads across the empire. But the Italian wars and then also the Austro-Prussian War further weakened the authority of the Habsburg Empire. And so the most important and significant political development for Austria in this time period is our third bullet point here, which is what we call the Ausschlag, or the Compromise of 1867. And this Ausschlag is what ultimately led to a dual monarchy and created the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So up to this point, before 1867, it was called the Austrian Empire. After 1867, it's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, of course, the Austro-Prussian War against Bismarck had been a military disaster. And Francis Joseph, the emperor, was now in a position of weakness. And he realized that he now had to deal with the Hungarians, who had been fiercely nationalistic and antagonistic. And so the resolution was the creation of what we call a dual monarchy, right? So essentially there are two countries, more or less. There's Austria and there's Hungary, and they are ruled by the Habsburgs. So each part of the constitution, or each part of the empire, both the Austrian and the Hungarian side, had their own constitution. Each had their own bicameral legislature. Each had their own government bureaucracy. Each had their own capital. Essentially, the Hungarians were granted home rule and had complete control over their own domestic affairs now. And this arrangement of the dual monarchy would last for about 50 plus years. But they had one single monarch still. So it's like one monarch, two countries. That's why we call it the dual monarchy. So a single monarch who was this was Francis Joseph I still, and he had two titles. He was the Emperor of Austria, and he was also the King of Hungary. So again, dual monarchy, but one person. And beyond that, Austria and Hungary also shared a common army. They shared foreign policy, and they shared a system of finances. So this is an excellent arrangement if you were Hungarian in the empire, or if you were Austrian, right? But if you were any of the other ethnic groups like Czech or Serbian or Croatian or Slovenian or Belarusian, you were not satisfied, right? Because this arrangement only enabled the German-speaking Austrians or the Hungarians to dominate other minorities. So the Hungarian nobility, for example, dominated the peasantry and any minority groups in the state of Hungary. And even beyond that, only 25% of adult men could vote in Hungary. So not only are there class differences, but the Slavic peoples of the empire, who made up another significant ethnic group, were really, really upset. This included the Polish people, the Croatians, the Czechs, the Serbs, the Slovaks, the Slovenes, and the Russians. And this is what led to the movement of Pan-Slavism in the Austrian Empire. Pan-Slavism is sort of like Slavic nationalism, despite the fact Slavic people do not have their own nation state. And we will see that Pan-Slavism comes to be a very disruptive force in the Austrian Empire. This is actually what eventually contributes to the outbreak of World War I. That's another story for another day. Oops. Now, my last point on the development of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, sort of looking ahead beyond 1870, is that the empire will continue to have the problem of all these different nationalities, all these different ethnic groups, and it will also see the rise of some of the most hostile anti-Semitism in all of Europe. So we know that the government was not integrated due to the differences among these various ethnic groups. One of the most important points of conflict was actually the language that was used in government and in schools. This was a particularly divisive issue because basically in the Austrian side of the empire, German was used, and in the Hungarian side, it was Hungarian. So this made a lot of the other ethnic groups feel alienated. There were efforts by both conservatives and socialists throughout the ensuing decades to diffuse national antagonisms by stressing economic issues, right? By trying to promote some economic unity, but this also proved to be unsuccessful. Finally, in 1907, a desperate Austrian government will grant universal male suffrage to the entire population of the empire. But this also exacerbates their tensions and their rivalries because now ethnic minorities wanted more autonomy in the parliament. They wanted more say. They wanted more voice. And parliament in the empire essentially became useless, and the Austrian prime minister was forced to use more emergency decrees and more military intervention just to govern on a day-to-day basis. So again, throughout the ensuing decades until we get to the early 20th century, the Austrian government is just being torn apart by these conflicts and these rivalries among the different ethnic groups. Now, another interesting development in all of this is that the threat of nationalities produced a backlash in the form of really violent and intense German nationalism, and with that, a rise of anti-Semitism across the empire. So here's a little bit more context. Jewish populations in Austrian cities had started to grow rapidly across the empire after Jews were given full legal equality in 1867. In fact, by 1900, Jews made up about 10% of the overall population in the empire. Many Jewish business people were also successful in banking and trade, while Jewish artists, intellectuals, and scientists also emerged and became prominent. One example, of course, is Sigmund Freud, who we'll talk about in the next lecture. But Jews, because of their success, became a target for German extremists and German nationalism who charged Jews with controlling the economy. They blamed Jews for corrupting German culture with alien ideas and ultra-modern degenerate art, which we'll see examples of later on. In the early 20th century, the mayor of Vienna, a man named Karl Lueger, Lueger, was especially prominent in his attacks on Jews, again, representing that extreme German nationalism and strong anti-Semitism. He would give speeches and rallies denouncing Jews in Vienna and their influence, and this is the environment in which Adolf Hitler was born into and grew up in. So, ultimately, unlike most major countries that used nationalism to strengthen the state in the second half of the 19th century, nationalism doesn't strengthen the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but instead the Austro-Hungarian will be progressively weakened and ultimately destroyed by nationalism by the time we get to World War I. And that brings us to an end of the 7.1 lecture. Thank you for listening, and we will see you again soon.